Scripture this morning is Leviticus chapter 25, starting in verse 8. God instructs his people, he says, "You shall count off 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the period of 7 weeks of years gives 49 years. Then you shall have the trumpet sounded loud on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the day of atonement. You shall have the trumpet sounded throughout all your land. And you shall hallow the 50th year, and you shall proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. You shall return every one of you to your property, and every one of you to your family." This is God's word. Our kids know why we can't have a dog. It's not because a dog requires lots of work, lots of money. Those are factors that we are aware of, but that is not the main reason. And our kids know this. Our kids know the main reason why we can't have a dog is that we rent our house. And we rent our house, and so we have to communicate repeatedly to them, like, this is not our house. We don't own this house. This doesn't belong to us, and so we need to live accordingly. We are simply sort of residents. We are, or perhaps guests in someone else's house. And if we were honest with you, and I'll be honest with you, there's a freedom that comes with this situation. We get to pass the buck. We get to say, well, no, we can't have a dog. It's really not our decision. This is more the decision of the people who own our home. And there's a liberation that comes with acknowledging an authority above us, in this case, our landlord. And I think as we're in this season exploring a generous life, especially as it concerns finances and money, I think there's a similar kind of freedom when it comes to money. When we think about money, do we wish we have more freedom? As you think about money, do you wish you had more freedom with how you engage with money? Because it's so easy for money to captivate us. It's so easy. I mean, those of us who perhaps have a little bit of money, it doesn't matter, because we're easily captivated by a desire for more. If we have a little, those of us who have a lot of money, guess what? We're easily captivated by a desire for more. It's this sort of reality of money, and we've in previous weeks we've explored the sort of mysterious power that money has sometimes over us. And so I think a lot of us desire freedom in one way or another from the enslaving grip of money. So what if I told you that you could be liberated from the tightened grip of money? And the passage this morning is part of a series of passages that I think help us down that path toward freedom. And this matters because if we're not liberated from the captivity of money, we'll miss out on a generous life. We'll miss out on experiencing and sharing a life of generosity. And liberation from captivity is of course, it's a holistic release. It's a release of our heart, our soul, mind, and strength. If any portion of our humanity remains captive, whether physically or spiritually, emotionally, mentally, whatever it might be, then we're not really experiencing the kind of liberty, the freedom that I think Jesus offers. So are we willing to allow Jesus to bring us toward a holistic liberation from the grip of money, of heart, soul, mind, and strength, to release all of that? And the question, just similar to like us living in our home, is, are we willing to acknowledge that there is a kind of freedom that comes when we surrender to an authority beyond ourselves? In this case, I think when we surrender our approach to money to the lordship of Christ, I think there's a freedom that comes with that. And it's important to note this first, because I think that the text that we're sitting with today and the broader context and some of the themes that we see throughout the rest of Scripture, inspired in part by this text, this will seem like utter and complete nonsense. It really will. It'll seem like complete and total nonsense as we unpack this for a bit. It'll seem like completely outlandish, nonsensical, sort of exhortations to something that could never possibly work. This is going to come in stark contrast to our 21st century, our Western, our North American, our capitalist identities. The question is, do we see those identity markers listed that I just mentioned? Do we see those as up for debate? Do we see those as identity markers that fall desperately short of our identity as those participating and experiencing and growing in Christ's kingdom? Are we willing to submit those identity markers to Christ's lordship? So some context behind the passage that I read earlier in Leviticus 25. God was instructing his people on how they should live as his holy people. They were delivered out of Egypt by God's mighty works through Moses. They were being brought to Canaan, and God was showing his people that life with him, that life under his leadership, under his rule, under his sovereignty, it includes every single aspect of living. Everything down to, the big, broad things, but then down to the very simple, minute things that you would maybe think don't matter, but God says, yes, they do. In other words, there was nothing outside of God's sovereignty. And this included economic structures. Leviticus 25, earlier in Leviticus, starting with verse 1, God instructs his people to have a Sabbath for the land every 7 years. And this was to be, so every seventh year it was going to be complete rest for the land. We see this in verse 5. And let's stop and consider this for a moment, especially now as we look at COVID and how the sort of world supply chain is being affected by farming and scarcity and all that stuff. Stop and think about what that might look like to give the land a complete and total rest for one whole year. What would that have been like in an agrarian culture, a culture that wholly depended upon the success of its crops? There were massive economic implications here. And God says, I want you guys to leave the land alone for a year. What a way to bear witness to God, right? What a way for the ancient Israelites, as Christopher J.H. Wright points out, to bear witness to God and by sort of embodying their submission to Yahweh's lordship, their obedience to his demands, his commands. But not just that, but they were not just obedient, but they were also very trustworthy. They trusted in God's providence, that even as they let the land alone for a whole year, God would still somehow provide. But God doesn't stop with that. He continues. He says, okay, so it's every 7 years, leave it alone. And then he continues, and this is where our text picked up this morning. It says, you shall count off 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the period of 7 weeks of years gives 49 years. Then you shall have the trumpet sounded loud. On the 10th day of the 7th month, on the day of atonement, you shall have the trumpet sounded throughout all your land. So, a couple things real quick. The 7 weeks of 7 years, 7 times 7 years, the number 7 is a symbol, a representation of perfection. And so in some sense, what the text is getting at here and what God's people should be understanding in this moment is that God is describing, he's about to describe, he's about to explain perfection upon perfection. 7 times 7, it's an expression of perfect perfection. And I know that's redundant, but it still is what this text is. It's sort of like this perfect times perfect times perfect. It's just perfect perfection. So what does that look like? What does that perfect perfection look like? This is what it looks like. It says, you shall hallow the 50th year, and you shall proclaim liberty. Liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. You shall return every one of you to your property, and every one of you to your family. Sorry, what? What was that? Return of property? Just give it back? What did I say? This is going to sound like nonsense. And before we get all up in arms and think this would result in total like the kind of total chaos of a rogue socialist state. Protestant reformer Johannes Brenz lived in the 15th and 16th centuries. He says, in that year, talking about the year of Jubilee, in that year, all quarrels, contentions, brawls, debts, legal actions, covenants, laws, letters, and seals were ended. In that year, there was a public composition and pacification of all civil controversies. How good does that sound right about now? Could raise your hand if you could go for an end to and a pacification of all civil controversies. Does that sound nice? How is this the case? How could that happen? How could people routinely and willingly relinquish property and assets that quote unquote belonged to them? And it comes down to a key concept. It's a key concept that's been a theme throughout our time in this series of generosity. And that concept is ownership versus stewardship. Ownership versus stewardship. Later in the chapter, we get a glimpse of how God is inviting his people to participate in a life of stewardship and not ownership. And here's the reminder in Leviticus 25:23. It says, "The land shall not be sold permanently, for the land belongs to me, for you are guests and residents with me." So just like our family doesn't exercise unchecked autonomy over what goes on in our rented house, the Israelites understood their residents to be as guests within the context of divine ownership and divine gift, as Wright points out. God owned the land, and God gave the Israelites access to the land as guests. Throughout those 49 years, you do your stuff, sell, buy, however you want. But be reminded, in that 7 times 7, in that 50th year, you will be reminded that whatever you think is yours, it is not yours, but it is mine, and I want it redistributed. I want it restored back to the people it belongs to. Drilling down a little bit further, there's Wright points out 2 important distinctions, and here are the distinctions that help kind of frame the concept of stewardship instead of ownership. Number one, it's God's land, right? It's Yahweh's land, and so the land was in Israel's possession, but it was under God's ownership, right? And that's stewardship. That's the term for that is stewardship. And by the way, this is where we as Christ followers, this is where we must learn well from our indigenous sisters and brothers. Our indigenous sisters and brothers following Christ, calling Christ their king, they do this much better than we do. Randy Woodley, who's a Christian theologian, Native American, writes this. He says, instead of a relationship where nature is below us, we should be stewarding with or co-sustaining all creation. Listen to this. Don't not hear this. Listen well to this. He writes again, he says, each area of creation is working with the Creator to maintain Earth's balance. The rain and snow, oceans and sun all sustain life on Earth. Animals regulate each other within their various natural cycles. Plants provide oxygen, food, and shelter for all of creation to coexist together. As human beings, we are co-sustainers with the rest of creation to ensure the abundant life for all creation the Creator intended. And God said, that is good. He continues and he says, look, when considering our relationship to the earth, Christians should view Jesus as Earth's creator and sustainer and simply cooperate with him in these tasks. God reminds us we are guests and residents, aliens and tenants with him. And these terms, guests and residents, there was a term used that would have been recognized by the people, the ancient Israelites, that were being shaped and guided by this text written down in Leviticus. It was a term that was used for people who resided among the Israelites, but were not Israelites themselves. They were not ethnic Israelites themselves, but they were simply kind of like descendants of dispossessed Canaanites or kind of like immigrants. They were sort of like the other, but lived within the Israelite community. And so they had no stake in the tenure of land, but they survived by hiring out their services as residential employees for land-owning households within Israel. And so the point here that God is making is like, yeah, you're kind of like them. You're here, you have some access to this stuff, but it doesn't belong to you. This is mine. You're welcome to be here. This land is owned by me. I am the supreme landlord, and you are my collective tenant. In other words, we are all renters on this earth, stewarding the majestic wonders of our Creator. So the first is that it's God's land. The second is that we are God's people, right? This concept of stewardship is framed in this idea that we are God's people. And remember, God has delivered his people out of slavery in Egypt, and he's leading them toward Canaan, the promised land. And what he does is he's building out the ways that his people would sort of reflect their fidelity to God, their Creator. He's building out the ways of holiness that point to God's glory. And part of this, in the rest of Leviticus 25, there's this continued reminder, this like sort of repeated phrase, where God reminds them that they are all his people, and sort of challenging a self-centered pursuit of wealth and advancement at the expense of the neighbor. There's this repeated phrase, and we see it in verse 25, where God says, if any of your kin falls into difficulty. It's repeated again in verse 35. It says, if any of your kin fall into difficulty. In verse 39, if any of you who are dependent on you become so impoverished that they sell themselves to you. Verse 47, if any of your kin fall into difficulty. The sort of repeated call of God toward his people, reminding them that not only do they belong to him, but they collectively, right, belong to one another, as this term kin is repeated over and over and over. That their relationship to one another is one that transcends any other kind of identity marker that they might have, which is in part why we as a church practice the sacred discipline of kinship. And think about how powerful a testimony this would be for the Israelites. What a kind of earth-shattering declaration of Yahweh's majesty and their ensuing faithfulness to Yahweh. Think what this would do to the ancient world as people peered into the life and times of the Israelites. It started with the sort of 7-year Sabbath where they submit to Yahweh's lordship and they obey him and they trust in God's providence. But then it continues with this cyclical year of Jubilee every 50 years. And they remember God's redemption. They remember that he is the one that brought them out of, they pass on God's forgiveness toward one another. They practice justice. And what do? They point toward an eschatological hope. They point toward a hope that ultimately they don't need to build up their own wealth and advancement at the sake of others, because they trust in God's goodness to bring about flourishing for all. And we stop and we, again, this doesn't make sense to our 21st century Western North American, capitalist framework. It just doesn't make sense. How could it? How can money and land just be given away and debts forgiven? It would lead to chaos. And this is perhaps the moment when we can stop and remind ourselves of how money, and we explored this a couple weeks ago, of how money is this tool that is so alluring, and it has like godlike qualities that are tempting to worship. And again, because if we think about sort of defacing the value of money, there's this feeling as if it would just sort of, we'd fall into chaos, and yet here God reminds us, right, that in the 50th year, the sort of expression of perfect perfection, there's this proclamation of liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. Liberty from the ever-increasing weight and burden of money. And so that in this moment, in this year of Jubilee, it wasn't just those who were in debt, who were experiencing liberty and freedom, but also those who were owed. Not just the debtor, or the people who owed the debts, but also the debtors themselves. Experienced a liberty from a growing gap between wealthy and poor. Wright also reminds us this was not just an arbitrary redistribution of land. It was not a redistribution, but it was in fact a restoration. See, land was distributed evenly as possible and down into households. So there was the sort of social structure of the ancient Israelites was broken up by tribe, clan, and then household. And the households were where land was distributed with sort of inalienable rights. And that at the end of 50 years, whatever sort of trading may have been going on and wealth building and debt, that would have been restored. And if a household had sold their property, it would have been returned to them so that they would not fall off the cliff into abject poverty. He writes that Jubilee then it's about restoring people to the capacity to participate in the economic life of the community for their own viability and for society's benefit. Not just for their own sake, but also for the sake of society, because when society has written people off to complete and utter devastating levels of poverty, society itself suffers. He reminds us that debt is a huge cause of social disruption and decay, and it tends to breed many other social ills, including crime, poverty, squalor, and violence. That this social and economic reset button, this sort of broad sweeping restoration, it wasn't practiced and observed perfectly over time. Of course it wasn't. But it did give a glimpse of the way that God longed for his people to move in solidarity toward a flourishing expression of humanity in concert with its creator. But as it goes, God's people experienced this stuff and perhaps it was lived out for some time. But over time it came to be seen as archaic and it was mostly disregarded. And yet the prophet Isaiah picks up the theme of this ancient practice of the year of Jubilee and incorporates it into a vision of a sort of prophetic vision of flourishing life under God's rule. And in the 61st chapter of Isaiah, there's this reference to this sort of perfectly perfect year, the year of Jubilee, and the language that's used in Isaiah 61 is this language in reference to the year of Jubilee, this sort of movement of liberty for all of God's people. Isaiah 61 uses this language, it says, the year of the Lord's favor. What a cool description, right? I mean, imagine if you were in total poverty and there was no way out, and then you were forgiven that, and then those who were wealthy and those who were poor all of a sudden found themselves in a situation where they could be in community with one another again, and there was this sort of leveling out, and then all of a sudden, like there's this sort of term that develops, like this is the year of the Lord's favor. And this is where things get really interesting for those of us who are following Jesus Christ. Because in Luke's gospel, there's this moment when Jesus makes a bold proclamation as he begins his ministry. In chapter 4 of Luke, he gets up and he reads from the Hebrew Scriptures. And of all the passages that he can read, as he picks up the scroll, of all the passages, of all the law and the prophets, of all the ways that Jesus could sort of describe this moment of him beginning his ministry, he chooses to read from Isaiah 61. And as he's beginning his ministry in Luke's gospel, Luke records Jesus declaring in some ways that his mission statement reads as follows. Jesus gets up and he reads and he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me, and he has sent me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, to liberate the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Part of the power that we see in this text here is that the mission of Jesus and therefore his followers has roots in Jubilee, the year of the Lord's favor. I am not saying that we copy and paste ancient Israel's economic policies onto our current culture. I'm not saying that. I'm also not saying we can completely ignore a posture that acknowledges our call to be stewards of our resources and not owners. This is not a call towards socialism. This is not a call toward capitalism. This is not socialism versus capitalism. As good old Winston Churchill put it, the inherent vice of capitalism is the unequal sharing of blessings, and the inherent virtue of socialism is the equal sharing of miseries. I think Michael Frost puts it well for us as we're trying to figure out how we fit, what does a generous life look like for a Christ follower as it concerns finances and money. He says, there is no political or economic system that can be labeled Christian. Only systems that are less Christian than others. In your critiques of socialism, don't make the mistake of assuming that capitalism is as pure as the driven snow. It's as slushy and muddy as some as the other alternatives. To bring us back to our Kingdom Identity series and our call to embrace a kingdom identity, it means that we are not defined by an economic structure. Frost continues, he says, Christians have managed to find a home in all kinds of political systems, including socialist Scandinavia and capitalist USA. He says Christians have contributed greatly to the common good in those systems, as well as critiquing them sharply when necessary. Our mistake is to imagine we are ever at home in any of them. This isn't socialism, it's not capitalism. And by the way, that's a false dichotomy. But when we acknowledge Jesus' proclamation of the year of the Lord's favor, we begin to see more clearly the contours of his kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven. And by the way, the early church took that seriously, right? When Jesus declares that his mission is to sort of bring a fulfillment to the prophetic vision we see in Isaiah 61, where he says, God has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, to release the captives, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Right? The early church took that seriously. And by the way, that is how, I suppose, that we can better understand passages that we read in the book of Acts that give us little glimpses into what the church was like at its inception. Well-known passages like Acts 2, where it says the believers devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the community, shared meals, to prayers. A sense of awe came over everyone. God performed many wonders and signs through the apostles. Listen to this. Listen to how it continues and how this demonstrates that they bore witness to the year of the Lord's favor. It says all the believers were united and shared everything. They would sell pieces of property and possessions and distribute the proceeds to everyone who needed them. Does that sound like the year of the Lord's favor to you? It's a communal way of living that bore witness to the year of the Lord's favor, the Jubilee year. Or Acts 4, another well-known passage, says the community of believers was in one heart and mind. None of them would say, this is mine, about their possessions. They held everything in common. Apostles continued to bear powerful witness to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and abundance of grace was at work among them all. Does that sound like the year of the Lord's favor? It says there were no needy persons among them. Those who owned properties or houses would sell them, bring the proceeds from the sales and place them in the care and under the authority of the apostles. Then it was distributed to anyone who was in need. Jesus came to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, and the church took him seriously. Consider these visions of self-sacrificial stewardship. People who bore witness to God with radical acts of generosity. And this, by the way, it's not socialism. And here, it's not socialism because these things weren't taken from them. They gave them up willingly. And they said, my life is compelled by something more than self-advancement and the gaining of wealth at the expense of others. And as we think about that, as we think about what that looked like, that sort of vision of this community that bore witness to God and His kingdom in the year of the Lord's favor, consider the history of our own nation as it played out under colonization, which was fueled by this sort of understanding that the sort of white colonists were superior to the indigenous populations, and therefore they were marginalizing indigenous populations as they moved west and sort of conquered this land. And again, Randy Woodley, this brilliant theologian, reminds us that one readily observes that the results of white supremacy upon the indigenous peoples in North America, especially as it played out in a capitalist society, was poverty. After all, one of the primary forms of capital in North America was land. And that stolen land was taken from native North Americans and used by white Euro-Canadians and Euro-Americans in order to create their own wealth. In the process, Native Americans found themselves trying to adapt to a land-based capitalistic society with little to no land capital. What a complete reversal from a community of Christ followers bearing witness to the year of the Lord's favor. And can we see how stealing land and dehumanizing people groups stands in clear opposition to the movement of Christ and His kingdom? I think the point that I hope we can sit with and acknowledge is this: that Jesus doesn't fit into our economic boxes, and neither do we. Jesus doesn't fit into our economic boxes, and neither do we. If you find yourself economically, politically homeless, I think you're probably hanging out in God's kingdom. Frost reminds us, in the Christian tradition, inequity and poverty have always been seen as evidence of a corrupt and sinful society. And God's people have always been called to practice the alternatives of generosity, hospitality, and justice. How do we apply this? What does that look like? I think one of the best charges of application that we can remind ourselves of comes from Romans 12, where Paul the Apostle simply says, do not be conformed to this world. Don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. If we find ourselves being forced into an economic structure that says Jesus is also here and He is nowhere else, don't conform to that pattern. Because Jesus doesn't fit nicely into our contemporary structures of economics. What does that look like? What can that look like? Pray through Luke 4. Read through Luke 4 where Jesus presents His mission. Pray through Acts 2. Pray through Acts 4. Pray through these passages. Pray through Leviticus 25. Pray as one liberated from the limiting boxes of contemporary economic models. Experience the liberty that Jesus offers with the year of the Lord's favor. And pray through these passages. Don't just read them. Invite God to speak to you. Invite God to speak to you in ways that lead you toward greater freedom from the grip of money. And Jesus doesn't fit into our economic boxes, and neither do we. And if we don't do this, if the challenge is if we don't acknowledge this, we miss out on experiencing God's kingdom, a life of generosity, of abundance, and we miss out on bearing witness to God's kingdom and sharing the kingdom of abundance, sharing the good news of Jesus. Again, remember, think of what it was like for the ancient Israelites to live in this cycle of Sabbath, this cycle of Jubilee, submitting to God's leadership, obeying Him, and trusting in God's providence, and remembering the story of God's redemptive movement, passing on the gift of redemption and forgiveness, practicing justice for the sake of neighbor, and pointing toward a hope that God will bring about ultimate flourishing to all people and all nations. And Jesus doesn't fit into our economic boxes, and neither do we. May we be agents, may we be ambassadors of the year of the Lord's favor, here and now and in the days to come.